Great. Okay, thank you. Well, thanks very much for the invitation to be here. As Abe said, I'm going to be talking today about a new approach that we're taking to try to understand some of the recent changes that we've been seeing in the lakes of Acadia. And the project that I'm talking about today is a very collaborative project. It's a partnership among Acadia National Park, Friends of Acadia, and the Climate Change Institute at the University of Maine. So I've listed some of the primary people, at least, who have been involved in this project over time. I do want to highlight, though, that Bill Gawley is really the driving force behind this project, and he's been part of it all along. He's the one collecting a lot of the long-term monitoring data, and as you can see in a lot of the pictures here, he's the one doing almost everything. But I do also want to mention we've had 5 great project scientists as part of this. So Alyssa, Shannon, Courtney, Kelsey, and Nora. This project is logistically fairly difficult, and they have been great with this project. The project is funded by Canon USA. It's part of the Wild Acadia project that Friends of Acadia has been running. And so our collaborative team is really interested in some of the changes going on in lakes across Acadia because we recognize the value of these systems. So there's a number of ways that these values are apparent. Of course, the aesthetic and recreational value that we're all familiar with, which translates into economic value as well. Certainly scientific and ecological values for these systems as well, and many of the lakes on MDI also serve as drinking water sources. In a broader sense as well, we know that lakes serve as sentinels of environmental change. So we often can see change in lake ecosystems before we see it on the landscape more broadly. So lakes are the lowest point in the landscape, and as such, they tend to integrate much of what goes on the watershed around them and the atmosphere around them. So when, for example, we see changes in water chemistry in lakes, it's oftentimes a sign that something broader is going on the landscape. So they can be an early warning system. So we're interested in the changes here because of the fact that they can be an early warning sign, and also because we can hopefully identify some threats to these ecosystems early. And so there are a number of different factors that you can look at in lake ecosystems to try to understand broader changes going on in an area. And one metric that you can look at is water clarity. And we measure it in a number of different ways, but one of the easiest ways is by using a Secchi disk, which is the black and white plate shown at the top there. I'm sure many of you are familiar with what a Secchi disk is. But if you lower it down into the water column, you look for the depth at which it's disappearing, and it gives you an indication of how clear the waters are. So this is a long-term data set that the park has been collecting. So we're going back through time here on each of these, and these are all different lakes in Acadia. And what you're seeing then is Secchi depth. So this is the surface of the lake, and then as you move down, the deeper the Secchi, the clearer the water. And what you're seeing across these lakes is that basically during the 1980s up until about the mid-1990s, these lakes were becoming clearer. But since the mid-1990s, we're seeing a decline in water clarity across Acadia's lakes. And this is a coherent change across the lakes that we're seeing. So over the last 15, 20 years, we're seeing a decline in water clarity. And we want to try to think about why is that happening? Well, first let's think about what affects water clarity. So there's actually 2 major substances that affect water clarity. And the first is chlorophyll, which is found in algae. And you're all familiar with the fact that if you get algal blooms in a lake, certainly the lake becomes less clear. It's not exactly a very desirable state for a lake to be in when you have a big algal bloom going on. So algae are one component that can affect water clarity. But dissolved organic carbon is another. And you may be familiar with this with other lakes in Maine where you have a sort of brownish stain to the lake waters, and it comes from this material. So dissolved organic carbon comes from plants on the watershed. You can see on this picture here the stain that leaves can leave behind on pavement. That's dissolved organic carbon right there. So the more dissolved organic carbon you have in water, the darker the brown stain to the water. So again, they're natural substances. They come from the watershed, but they're another important material that affects water clarity. So if we look back at the 6 lakes that I had just shown you with the Secchi-disc transparency data, we can look back to 1995, and we do that just because dissolved organic carbon, or the DOC measurements, really only started happening about the mid-1990s. That's about the time it got onto people's radars in terms of this is something we should be measuring. And the park has one of the best long-term data sets for looking at dissolved organic carbon data. So DOC is shown in the dark circles on these plots, and chlorophyll is in the clear circles. You can see that over time, there's not much of a change in chlorophyll across these lakes, but many of the lakes are showing an increase in dissolved organic carbon concentrations during the same time frame where water clarity has been decreasing. So we're seeing a link between increasing dissolved organic carbon concentrations and decreasing water clarity in these lakes. Why would dissolved organic carbon be increasing across these lakes? This is what we're trying to figure out at this point. And we know that there are a number of changes that have been occurring during the same time frame. Sulfate deposition has actually been declining in our region, of course, and sulfate deposition can influence how much dissolved organic carbon makes it into surface waters. Sulfate affects the ionic strength and pH of soils, and it affects how soluble dissolved organic carbon is. And so in a number of studies in other regions have shown that with recovery from sulfate deposition, you can actually see more dissolved organic carbon entering lake ecosystems. So this actually could be a positive sign of recovery from sulfate deposition. But during this same time frame, this isn't the only factor that's been changing. We know that we've been seeing an increase in the frequency of rain events in the northeastern US and actually more broadly in other parts of the country as well. Particularly over the last 50 to 60 years, the frequency of intense storms has been increasing. And so one of our big questions is to what extent this might be playing a role even in just what's happening over the past couple decades. Our long-term monitoring data set is really important and a really great data set for answering some of our questions. But for thinking about changes in extreme events like storms, we need data at a higher temporal resolution, and we need to be able to pair that with the long-term monitoring to get a better perspective on what's happening in our lakes. And so that was the focus of this project that we've launched, is to get that high temporal resolution data so we can understand some of the links with extreme events better. And so we're focusing on Jordan Pond, and the reason for this is that Jordan Pond is not only the clearest lake in the park, it's the clearest lake in Maine. We view it as a Sentinel system, as being very sensitive to even small changes in the watershed and the atmosphere around it. And so this is the focus of our project. And so to get that high temporal resolution data, we've installed a sensor buoy into the lake. And I'll tell you a bit more about what the buoy measures. Some of you may have seen this in Jordan Pond. This is what it looked like in 2013. And in response to the sort of in-your-face color scheme of the buoy, we gave it a makeover. So this is what it looks like now in 2014. So it's a nice gray color with the white buoys. It blends in much better. The manufacturer sends it to you in that bright yellow color with the orange buoys because they're afraid somebody in a motorboat is just going to plow over it if they can't see it. It's not so much of an issue on Jordan Pond, so we're able to camouflage it here. So thinking about some of the data that the buoy collects, we have readings that are taken every 15 minutes from the buoy. There's a number of water quality parameters that are measured by the buoy, things like temperature, pH, and conductivity. We have a sensor that also measures organic matter, so linking it back to the dissolved organic carbon metric that we're interested in. Chlorophyll as well, because that can affect water clarity. And then we do also have light measurements being taken so that we can assess how water clarity is changing in the lake as well. We also have a weather station that's mounted on the Jordan Pond house, and this collects data like air temperature, wind speed, rain, and also light conditions there as well. So we can couple the data between these two sites. There's also a communication package on this. So the data are relayed from the buoy on Jordan Pond to the Jordan Pond house, and then we can download it from a computer so that we can actually check twice a day on what the conditions are in the lake right now. So I wanted to just show you some of the data that we've collected so far. We've been working on this now, so the summer of 2013 and now over this past summer as well. Much of our focus so far has been on the logistics of actually collecting the data. So getting the buoy up and running, actually getting the data in place. The next phase is data management. As Abe had pointed out, it does take quite a bit of time, and also getting more into the data analysis. So what I'll show you are just a couple examples of some plots over time of what we can see with this buoy. So this shows you surface temperature, and you can see this is from the summer, part of the summer of 2013. And what you're seeing in the black squares is the data that come from the long-term monitoring. So the monthly monitoring where we go out and take a sample on one day and assess the conditions. What you're seeing with the red line is what's being reported by the buoy. So you can see we're getting much better temporal resolution, of course, in terms of what's happening with temperature over time, and a much more complete picture of how temperature changes over the course of the season. As I mentioned, we also have a probe that shows us what's happening with the dissolved organic material in this system. So again, we're looking back at the summer of 2013 here, seeing how dissolved organic material changes over time. And we can couple that with daily rain data. So we can see what happens as we have rain events in the system here. And so just looking at this example, what you can see is with the first event, we're not seeing much change in dissolved organic carbon after that one. A second event, we see a bit of a spike, but then lower values, but still higher than what we were seeing earlier on in the season here. And then with the third event later in the season, we're seeing a more sustained elevation of dissolved organic carbon. So this is just one example of some of the types of data that we're able to collect with this buoy and to get that higher temporal resolution perspective on what may be happening in the system here. So as I said, our next steps are really to dive into some data management and data analysis, but I want to just give you some sense of what we're able to see with this higher temporal resolution perspective here. We're going to be connecting the Jordan Pond buoy then with other buoys around the world. So there's a larger scale initiative among lake ecologists to do this type of research, to gather this high temporal resolution data. And there's a network called the Global Lake Ecological Observatory Network, or GLEON, and you can see some of the different locations there where people have already put in sensor buoys into their lakes. And so at the end of this month, I'll be going to a meeting of GLEON up in Canada, and we'll be announcing Jordan Pond as a new site in this global network of lakes. We've also done quite a bit of outreach on this project as well. And so we've been working with Friends of Acadia, of course, and we have a blog that's been appearing on their website. We've also prepared flyers for visitors and park personnel about what the buoy is doing. And we also are, we've basically just gotten a website online, which I'll show you in a second here. And we're also working on a kiosk that we're hoping we'll be able to house at the Jordan Pond House. That will be an interactive display that people can basically go to and check on the data for Jordan Pond for that day. So let me escape out of this. And I just wanted to show you, in case you're interested in learning more about the buoy, we have a website, jpbuoy.com. And we're still fine-tuning it, as people are always doing with their websites. But we made a lot of progress on it, so it is up, and you can go to it. And you can see that if you scroll down, there's a lot of information giving you some context here. And then if you go to, there should be links up on top. Usually they're on the top here, but if you go to the data live, and you can scroll down. So the data updates at 10 a.m. and 10 p.m. daily, and you can take a look and see what's going on in the lake, either in the morning or the evening. And there's a fair amount of information here, but you can see, for example, pH and conductivity. If you scroll down this, you can also see chlorophyll, temperatures in the water column, and there's also the weather station data as you scroll down here as well. So you can get information on wind, also the air temperature, and daily rain in the, at the Jordan Pond House as well. So I encourage you to check that out if you're interested. And with that, I will say thank you.
Great. Thanks a bunch, Jasmine. Are there questions?
Yeah.
Jasmine, are there other lakes that you know of in Maine or New England that have this sophisticated buoy monitoring? And the second part of the question is, how expensive is this equipment?
Yeah. Okay. So there are other lakes now. There's Colby College has one on Great Pond, and the Lakes Environmental Association has just put one in on Highland Lake, and Holly Ewing at Bates College has put one in on Lake Auburn as well. And it's interesting because it all sort of happened at the same time, independently. We were able to instrument a lot of these lakes, and so. Each of our groups has been very focused on the logistics up until this point, and we're talking about getting together sometime this year and start to make some links across these lakes in Maine. The cost varies quite a bit depending on how many bells and whistles you have on there. I will say, because of the types of questions we have for Jordan Pond related to water clarity, changing organic material, we have one of the best buoys I'm aware of. It does have quite an extensive suite of parameters that we're able to look at to address these questions that we're interested in. Cost-wise, I think you can go as cheap as $20,000. So I would say like a ballpark would be something between $20,000 to $50,000 for the most part. So.
What is the impact of increased level of dissolved organic carbon on the ecosystem of a lake or on the ability to drink the water? Is there more filtration needed, and what does it do to a lake or pond?
Right. So would you like me to answer it in terms of an increase in dissolved organic carbon? Okay, yeah, an increase as we've seen over the past few decades. So in terms of drinking water, dissolved organic carbon actually is it makes it more difficult to treat drinking water. There are a number of disinfection byproducts that result from the treatment process when it interacts with dissolved organic carbon. So it is a concern for a number of water districts around in terms of if they're seeing increasing DOC, it's something they need to take into account as part of their treatment strategy. For the lake ecosystem itself, DOC is actually one of the most important regulators of lake ecosystems in that it strongly affects how much light can enter the system. It's a good thing in that it's a sunscreen for a lot of aquatic organisms. But then in terms of visible light, it certainly can reduce how much visible light is coming in. It affects the temperature structure of the lake. If you have more DOC, you tend to get warming sometimes in the surface waters. DOC is also a carbon source for bacteria, so it can promote bacterial growth. Time or no? Oh, I have, okay.
Excuse me. You're part of a network of stations all over the world, and what will be the utility of the information you get from that?
Yeah, so with Gleon, the network that we're joining at the end of this month, they're part of a movement which is called network science, where rather than focusing on, well, there's a lot you can get out of focusing on one site, but there are other questions you can address by thinking about what's happening across multiple sites. So for example, in thinking about drivers such as atmospheric deposition, climate change, if you can look across gradients, it actually can be a really helpful way to try to understand what's happening in your ecosystems here. So there are a number of papers that have been coming out from this network where they're trying to address some of the questions of larger scale by adding all of these sites together. So.
You touched on sulfates. And could you update me, does that mean that New England and Maine has had less problems with acidification of the lakes?
Sorry, whether it's...
Has less, we have had less acid rain and less acidification of the waters in the lakes.
We are seeing recovery. So actually, Sarah Nelson would be a perfect person to talk to during the poster session. She's been measuring sulfate in another long-term data set of lakes across the state. And we are seeing, over recent decades, there is a reduction in sulfate that we're seeing in the surface waters as well.